All right, so it's a pleasure to be talking to you guys today. My name is Bernard Gagan. I'm a senior lecturer in the history and theory of digital media here at King's College, and I want to talk to you a little bit about the concept of transmedia. Now, what is transmedia? In general, when one thinks of transmedia, one might think, for example, of content that circulates across platforms. You could have, for example, a film. That film could have multiple iterations. It could have an iteration that happens on the screen. It could have a video game format. It could have something like associated figurines or board games. And the development of this film as a franchise could circulate from one medium to another. It could be planned in a way that takes into account the characters, the stories, over time will develop in multiple media, right? So this is one way of thinking about transmedia. Another way of thinking about transmedia is as a kind of product or a consequence of the intertwining of digital media, the intertwining of media in general since the 1990s, right? So in this conception, the World Wide Web is, among other things, a kind of universal medium. The World Wide Web can have digital computational documents circulating on it. It can have films on it. It can have pictures on it. It can have sounds on it. So the distinctions say that used to organize the way we think about media. You have films, you have television, you have books. No longer holds in an age of something like the World Wide Web. In that sense, transmedia could be not only a particular strategy for circulating content across media, but it could also be something like a description of the objective conditions of media today at a time when platforms such as, I'm sitting by a window. You guys are going to get some transmedia sound interference. I apologize for that. So transmedia could be a description of a change in the general conditions of media today. Wherein formerly distinct channels intertwine because of technologies such as the World Wide Web. But even, to be honest, I talk about the World Wide Web because I'm born in the 70s, and to me, the World Wide Web is kind of the frontier of digital media. But I could imagine that for many of you, you might regard video game consoles, or your smartphone or something like that as, say, your chief interface into the world of global media, in which case it's not so much necessarily about the World Wide Web, but it could be your telephone that is the chief way for understanding transmedia. And certainly the typical telephone today is the smartphone is a platform for photographs. It is a platform for writing letters. It is a platform for watching movies. It can be a platform for reading PDFs for this class. I don't particularly recommend that. If you really want to read a PDF well for class, printing it out and working by hand is extraordinarily productive. It's more productive than working on your phone. However, in an era of transmedia, you may well choose to use your telephone for that. The point being, what we're describing here are a whole number of activities that formerly took place across single channels and today might take place on one single platform. And it may even be that what you're producing in a way circulates from one form to another. So it might be that in the course of giving you a lecture, you take a photograph of my slides. As you take the photograph of my slides, then you might email that to a colleague, a fellow person in the class, and that person might go ahead and transcribe them into notes, which they could post on Moodle so that the class could share them. Right? So there we have a kind of transmedia event, which is possible within contemporary media ecologies. Right? So these are some ways of having a concept of what we're talking about when we talk about transmedia. We could be talking about specific commercial strategies to organize the circulation of content. We could be talking about the incidental circulation of content across platforms. Or we could be talking about a general media ecology, a general network of relations among media at the present moment. That means that you're never really working on one medium in isolation, but every single content is constantly seeping into or even being actively pushed into other media so that a medium is in fact always a transmedium, a circulation, a between media, a between platforms. It may well be that in 50 years we don't even talk about transmedia because the concept is tied to a 20th century notion of distinctions among media. Okay, so that's a general kind of overview of some associations of transmedia. Now, what I want to do in my remarks today is to get you thinking about some other sources or backgrounds for transmedia. I want you to think about the history of transmedia, about how it is that transmedia is manufactured. How is it that we start dealing with the problem that content can and should circulate across media, across platforms. And I'm going to suggest to you we look for two particular sites for the origins of these. On the one hand, we look towards fields such as psychology and cognitive science, even fields like psychotherapy. And I'm going to suggest that in these fields, you saw an early theorization of what it means to have a type of content or media that's circulating back and forth between humans and machines. And that this problem of thinking about how content circulates between humans and machines was itself a place for working through the implications of what would eventually become transmedia. That's the first site. Actually, to tell you the truth, that's the second site we're going to talk about today. I'm going backwards. The other site we're going to talk about is warfare. What are the conditions of 20th century warfare such that scientists, engineers, and of course, some of the people I've already mentioned, psychologists, started thinking about new ways, new conditions in which you could circulate information rapidly from one site to the next into different types of modes, into different types of media, right? Because our contemporary transmedia world, which is largely a kind of commercial space, diversion space, and entertainment space, in many ways is produced in the laboratories, in the engineering teams of the mid-20th century, and even going back as far as the 1910s and 1920s, to be honest, right? So these two sites, areas of psychology and the field of battle in the 20th century war, are the places I'm going to ask you to look at today to think about a different background for all of this kind of transmedia phenomenon that I mentioned, that I offered an initial introduction to at the beginning of my remarks today. Now, you may or may not have received some readings, but I've put a couple of readings here on the screen that could be a key place for thinking through this longer history of transmedia. One essay I'd strongly consider is J.C.R. Licklider's 1960 essay, Man-Computer Symbiosis, which develops this idea of a symbiosis between humans and machines. That is, the idea that humans and machines are each a kind of organism that could live together, right? That's one of the meanings of symbiosis, organisms that live together in a mutually beneficial way. And this idea of human-machine symbiosis, again, he uses the term man-computer. I'm saying human-machine because I think we've moved beyond the assumption that machines are simply there to be used by man, or that the notion of man can refer to all machines in general. So we could have a whole lecture here, a whole course here on what it means that early concepts of transmedia were closely tied to male users. That's a lecture for another talk today. I'm going to simply reframe some of what he's saying to talk about human-computer or human-machine symbiosis. And in this notion of symbiosis that he puts forward, you already have some type of notion of ecology, right? Because a symbiosis generally refers to a dynamic interrelation among two organisms where the activities of one shape the other and vice versa. So you have this vision of an ecology, a vision of a system of feedback that very closely relates to what I already mentioned to you, transmedia as being this circulation of media across platforms. The difference, of course, being that for someone like J.C.R. Licklider, when he's thinking about this circulation, this ecology, this symbiosis between the human and the machine, the human is one of the media here, so to speak. The computer is the other media. And this idea of the circulation between the human and the machine, rather than simply the translation across different modes, is the sort of key site for seeing how he articulates an early notion of transmedia. I'm not going to say a whole lot about that essay. I just have a few remarks in the next few minutes, but I'd suggest you sort of look at it to see one site where there were early mid-20th century efforts to imagine how is it that humans and machines will work together such that a piece of information, a piece of content, circulates back and forth in a type of live interactive mode. Some other things I'd suggest you look at is an essay by Ivan Sutherland called Sketchpad, a man-machine graphical communication system. This was one of the first efforts to develop a computer with a lively graphical interface. Not the first, but one of the first ones, where you start seeing, again, the notion of interactivity, the notion of some type of live, real-time exchange and circulation between humans and machines going hand in hand with a conception of media as not being something static, not just a book or a film, but rather something that is being produced in real time through interactive feedback between a human and its user. Together, these two essays form a particular set of, how would you describe it? Fundaments. A set of fundaments for seeing early attempts to think through a new mode of interactivity with machines that is based on human users interacting in real time with rapidly changing content. Now, there's also a broader history for their thinking, right? And the broader history for their thinking is gestured towards in some ways in the other two readings. One would be the Cognitive and Perceptual Training in the Cold War Man-Machine System essay, which discusses how and why in the Cold War the problem of training, in particular soldiers, to work rapidly in real time with, for example, computers became a new concept. It became a new problem. I'll say some more remarks today about that. And then Deborah Weinstein's essay, Systems Everywhere, Schizophrenia, Cybernetics, and the Double Bind, provides a clue of what happens when some of these thinking about humans and machines as interacting systems starts to seep into other fields. For example, psychotherapy or family therapy. And from that, you start developing a broader conception of how it is that we could understand human activity as being perpetually involved in communication, where you have content constantly circulating and modulating as it travels, not just among humans and machines, but among humans in general. So those are the four essays I've circulated, or I've suggested you take a look at. And they provide a kind of historical framework for the story, for the history I'm going to give you of transmedia today. Here are the kind of key takeaways, the key points that I want you to sort of remember from today's lecture before I get into the real details. So in the mid-20th century, from 1940 to 1965, there is a proliferation of large-scale technological military activities. And many of these are tied to high-speed conditions of modern warfare. So you have the rise of jets, you have the rise of missiles, you have the ability to engage enemies at great, great distances. So the ability to engage enemies with great distance, plus the rapid speed of new weapons, means that there's a new search for mechanisms to allow humans and machines to communicate very rapidly to deal with highly stressful, rapidly changing conditions on the battlefield. And so out of that, you get a kind of problem that leads to the development of transmedia systems, right? The problem is that humans can't react as quickly to the conditions of war as the machines that they're dealing with can react to the war. So you need to develop a new method of having rapid communication between humans and machines. Lively interfaces are that solution. Now, within the development of lively interfaces, of screens, of sound effects, of various other multimedia interfaces to machines, you get a new way for thinking about human cognition, human thought, right? And this is the idea that human thought is something that flows, that is networked. It's not necessarily even limited to things inside the head. As you deal with large-scale information and computing systems where humans are one element, it starts to even look like thinking or cognition is happening in machines and humans at the same time. And the problem of, say, designing better machines will be to design a kind of collaborative cognition between humans and machines, okay? And so this notion of collaborative cognition goes hand in hand with the development of these lively interfaces, because lively interfaces become a way that the machine language can be translated into the human language and vice versa. And as this happens in the mid-20th century, fields such as cognitive psychology, family therapy, begin developing conceptions of human thought, human activity, human agency that are closely linked to networks of communicating systems. And out of this, you get a kind of massive complex for rethinking multimedia communication, for rethinking human action, human intelligence as a product of multimedia circulation. Okay? So those are some of the key ideas that I'm going to explain today by looking at a couple of particular technologies, a couple of particular case studies, particularly the rise of radar and some developments in psychotherapy. Now, I'm going to actually pause here. I think we've got about 16 or 18 minutes. I'm going to pause, save this video, let you all get your bearings, and then I'll move to the next stage of my talk.